Hi people, my innovation back here again as always and as usual. Yeah, it's time for another astrological video, astrology video, whatever you want to call it. Instead of mental illness and or wealth and finances, so the predecessors, I am going to discuss violence and or criminal behavior. And in the same tone, referring to my earlier video, so the so-called predecessors, in someone's constellation, so the constellation that they're born under, you can also deduct essentially what you can essentially also deduct what kind of criminal behavior someone will display, if any. Okay, so yes, even the constellation under which someone is born, the planetary constellation, which is given away in their natal chart or natal astrology, or displayed, conveyed, whatever. It will also give away information on whether someone will be violent, and if so, to what extent, and or which extent, or display criminal or dishonest behavior, and in what areas of a person's life. Now, let's get down to it. By default, the planets that hypothetically speaking do the most damage are Mars, Saturn, and Pluto. These planets deal with destruction, okay? Mars deals with destruction. Mars is the front runner. Mars is absolute number one. Mars is the undisputed champion of violence and therefore also of criminal behavior, of course. That's essentially violence gone in a different direction, okay? In the wrong direction. Essentially the positive aspect of violence is courage and simply being dapper. The negative side is criminal behavior and underhandedness and just outright extremist behavior or destructive behavior, to the point where it benefits no one except the criminal himself, maybe not even then, or the perpetrator himself or herself. In any case, yeah, Mars is number one. Saturn is number two. We all know Saturn as the bad guy when it comes to astrology, and Saturn is essentially the planet that indicates your weak link. What are you bad at? What is your weak? What's the chink in your so-called armor? What is the weak spot, or what is your weak point? Last but not least, Pluto. Pluto also deals with that, but Pluto deals more with affecting a lot of people, an entire group of people. Pluto deals with essentially with tyrants. It deals with leadership ability, and when that leadership ability goes in the wrong direction, think of a fanatical cult that gets people to kill themselves, okay? Referring to, I forgot his name, Jim Jones, for example. You name it. I don't know, I haven't taken a look at Jim Jones's natal reading. I'm just bringing it up for good measure's sake. I mean, his natal chart. I don't know what constellation he was born under, but there's a good likelihood that he did not have a well-aspected Pluto. He had an afflicted Pluto, a substantially afflicted one at that. Now, referring back to these three planets, by default, Mars by default, okay, is weak when it's in Libra, when it's in Taurus, and when it is going retrograde in someone's natal chart. So the constellation that they were born under, if Mars is going retrograde, Mars is aspected negatively to other planets, then yeah, generally speaking, criminal behavior will come afoot. A simple example is, for example, if Mars is in Aries and Mars is going retrograde. Hold on for a second. Yeah, it's very similar to what I discussed in my previous video, Astrology and Wealth or Finances. I already discussed there that, for example, Mars in the second house will produce some form of greed if it's afflicted. But with Mars being violent, it goes a step further. For example, if Mars is in Aries or in Scorpio and Mars is going retrograde, then generally speaking, the person will be greedy, and the people will resort to anything, including being violent. Okay, think of a bank robber, like I said in the other video. Think of someone that kills someone else and robs them, essentially robbery, homicide, or homicide, robbery, whatever. Those are examples. Mars in the 8th house, the house that Scorpio rules over, as opposed to the 2nd house, which Taurus rules over. It's the same deal. If Mars is there, for example, regardless of which zodiac sign Mars is in, but Mars is afflicted, it's negatively aspected to other planets, or it's going retrograde, and those aspects also indicate the same thing, then yeah, there's going to be criminal behavior. Think of someone that commits fraud. In the earlier video, I already said that The eighth house, essentially, as opposed to the second house, so the house that Scorpio rules over, it deals with other people's money. The second house, the house that Taurus rules over, deals with your own money. The eighth house deals with Scorpio's house, deals with money belonging to third parties or second parties, whatever. In any case, money that belongs to, for example, financial institutions like payment processors, banks, and whatnot. And if you, for example, were born under a constellation where Mars is afflicted, and Mars is, for example, in Scorpio's house, and it's going retrograde, or it's negatively aspected to, for example, the other planets, Saturn and Pluto, then it's not good, okay? It stands for a high probability of you, at some point in your life, committing fraud. The scale on which you'll commit fraud depends on the entire constellation as a whole, essentially, under which you're born. Okay, worst case scenario is that you'll just outright commit fraud repeatedly, and you name it. You'll commit forgery, anything else that you can think of, and everything else. That's what Scorpio, generally speaking, stands for. That's where Scorpio comes into play. If Mars is, for example, in Aries, then that keyword is violence. Aries stands for violence. That means that you'll be violent, plain and simple. Okay, you'll kill people in order to get what you want. You'll cut people down. Again, think of a bank robber that takes no prisoners, or that has a similar attitude, a take no prisoners attitude, and just shoots the place up and says, for every minute that I don't get my money, and I am not provided with an escort, and blah 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 blah, the kind you see in movies, I'm going to kill one hostage. Yeah, someone like that, the likelihood of them being born under a heavily afflicted Mars, like in the example I gave, Mars in Aries and whatnot, then yeah, it's very likely, okay? There's a high probability of that being the case. If these three planets are by default negatively aspected to one another, so Mars, Saturn, and Pluto are negatively aspected to one another, by default negative aspects are a square and an opposition. A square is when two planets are 90 degrees removed from each other. So if you, for example, you simply check out your own astrological chart under which you were born, so your own natal chart, the constellation, planetary constellation under which you were born, and you're seeing, for example, that Mars is 90 degrees, the default orb, an orb is simply an allowed distance within astrological rules, that two planets are supposed to be aspected to one another, or they have a relationship to one another. That's called an orb, ORB, an orb. So for a negative aspect like a square, for example, where two planets are they touch upon each other, but at an angle of 90 degrees, so at a 90 degree angle, the maximum that is given in the way of a leeway is 8 degrees. So 8 degrees up and 8 degrees down. So between 82 degrees and 98 degrees, that counts as a negative aspect, specifically a square. That is negative aspect number one, a major negative aspect, and negative aspect number two is an opposition. The word speaks for itself. It's when two planets are opposed to one another. So if Mars, for example, is opposed Saturn or Pluto, and vice versa, that means that they're opposed to one another. So they're at a 180 degree angle of one another. That's how they touch upon each other. And the orb is also 8. So the distance that is given in the way of leeway, so the allowed distance, maximum allowed distance, is generally speaking also 8. In extremest of cases, it can be 10, but generally speaking, you can stick to 8. So think 180 degrees down and 180 degrees up. So 180 minus 8 equals 172. So anything between 172 degrees and 188 degrees counts as an opposition. So yeah, if these three planets are negatively aspected, the likes of which I described, then yeah, generally speaking, it spells for bad news. It spells either violent behavior, forceful behavior, or wanton behavior. Okay, wanton as in WANTON. Just plain and simply being imprudent, as in trying to force your way upon others. And you can see what direction it's going in, okay? If you keep going in that direction, then it simply leads to criminal behavior. It leads to, best case scenario, dishonest behavior, as in simply being underhanded, being sneaky, being manipulative in order to get what you want. That doesn't have to go so far to the point where it becomes criminal, but it's not a good mentality to have. And And in the worst case scenario, you'll be an outright criminal and you'll be locked up for life, or you'll be killed in action, so to speak. KIA. Now, I'm going to discuss the aspects specifically, just as an example, because these three planets don't only have to be aspected to one another. There are other planets that when any of these three planets are aspected to, the likes of which I described, either through a square or through an opposition, that it spells bad news, okay? So any other planet counts. Specifically, I'm going to give examples. Now, one exception is, for example, a positive aspect. If Mars is conjunct Pluto, for people that don't know what a conjunction is, that's when two planets are next to each other. And the rule, the orb, in the way of the leeway, the spatial leeway that is given is the same, so 8 degrees. So if two planets are close to one another and they're at least 8 degrees close to each other, so for example, one planet is 10 degrees in a specific zodiac sign and another planet is 18 degrees in the same zodiac sign, or whether it's the same or not, bottom line is, if it's within touching distance of 8 degrees, then it counts as a conjunction. Again, in extreme cases, even 10 degrees would be allowed, but it depends on the situation. But rarely is that the case. Generally speaking, you can stick with 8 degrees. Now, that's called a conjunction, okay, when they're next to each other within those confines or guidelines. Now, Mars conjunct Pluto also produces criminal behavior in general, but when poorly developed, in poorly developed people. So let's just say people that, generally speaking, on the most well-educated, on the most intellectual of people that lack rationalization, if you will, or the ability to be rational, and similar. So essentially a dunderhead. Okay, if a dunderhead was born under Mars conjunct Pluto, an absolute imbecile, then yeah, think of a mindless imbecile that does stuff like shoplifts, steals shit from a store, stuff like that. Okay. Now, example number 2, Mars square Neptune. Oh boy, not good. Yeah, if any of these planets is square Neptune, then it's generally speaking not good. It's not good. Mars square Neptune is an example of criminal behavior, okay? Neptune has to do with your mentality, and Mars simply stands for what drives you, forcefulness, essentially, okay? What really gets you going, what turns you on a spiritual level. So you can imagine that if these two planets are negatively aspected to one another, for example, Mars square Neptune, like I said, then yeah, it will lead to criminal behavior. It stands for a bad mentality and essentially having a forceful mentality regardless of the moral implications involved. So in short, plain and simply put, criminal activity, regardless of what kind of activity it is. Mars opposed Saturn is another example. Definitely not good. If Mars is opposed Saturn, then it's, again, these two planets are bad news in general, especially when they're heavily afflicted. And if they're opposed one another, approximately a 180-degree angle, then yeah, it simply stands for destructive, forceful criminal behavior, again, regardless of the implications involved. A surprising planet is Venus. Venus specifically, when it's opposed Pluto, or better said the other way around, Pluto opposed Venus, is not good. Okay, Venus is generally speaking stronger with women. So Pluto opposed Venus, a woman that's, for example, born under Pluto opposed Venus, will be highly likely to commit fraud and related, in any case, criminal activity, embezzlement, you name it. Think of someone that simply defrauds. Think of a woman that works in a bank and it turns out that, the usual stuff that you see making the headlines, so to speak, or at least make a news bulletin, that a woman simply defrauded a bank she worked for an untold amount of money ever since she worked there for like half a year, etc. She essentially funneled money somewhere specifically to her own account, you name it. That's an example of Venus opposed Pluto, or better said, a Pluto opposed Venus. Now, moving on, Saturn and Scorpio. If Saturn is badly afflicted in Scorpio, it has a lot of negative aspects, like squares and oppositions to other planets, or it is in an uncomplementary planet. Let's just say an uncomplementary astrological house that it's weakened. For example, Aries, the first house, Saturn in the house of Aries, and it's in Scorpio. Yeah, someone like that in general will not be a pleasant person. It's someone that will be forceful and will produce criminal behavior, okay, in the extremest of cases. Mars in the second house if Mars is afflicted. I already treated that in the previous video. Wait until the end screen if you want to see the previous videos I already did. Specifically when it comes to wealth. Mars in the second house, long story short, again, if it's afflicted, so if Mars is negatively aspected, Mars is in a really difficult position, Mars is afflicted, plain and simple, yeah, will lead to greed, essentially, without the implications involved. Greed, plain and simple greed. Okay, someone like that will be greedy and will like steal money and shit like that, you name it, be materialistic. Moving on, Mars in the 10th house. Okay, the 10th house is the house that Capricorn rules over, and Mars there, generally speaking, is strong. But if Mars is afflicted, it has a lot of negative aspects. It has 1 or 2 oppositions, 1 or 2 squares, and specifically to, for example, Saturn and Pluto, then yeah, it stands for someone that will be in a position of authority, someone that has the potential to do so, but the person will abuse their power. Think of a CEO, think of a police officer, think of a judge, all of these people that are corrupt. Anyone, someone, this is actually, honestly speaking, relatively speaking quite common. Okay, think of the CEO that essentially embezzles money from his own company, and the board of shareholders simply finds it out after an extensive amount of time, you name it. Think of a corrupt judge that takes kickbacks from any other political official in order to, for example, free a buddy of his or her out of a nasty situation involving a lawsuit or similar, you name it. Any authority-based figure in society, think of a corrupt cop, it just goes on, that essentially falls to corruption, or that becomes corrupt essentially. Mars in the 10th house, an afflicted Mars in the 10th house is an example of that. Mercury square Saturn, yeah, Mercury square Saturn in general, also not good. Okay, Mercury again stands for your thought processes, your mind. And if Saturn is square Mercury, then yeah, it can produce criminal behavior in the extremest of cases. Okay, you name it. This position also, generally speaking, doesn't bode well. But not so much criminal behavior. Think of being dishonest. Think of someone that schemes, essentially. Someone says, hey, I'm going to pit 2 people against each other so I can get away with this or get away with that. It's not necessarily criminal. Only criminal in the absolute extremest of cases. In the best case scenario, it's simply someone that likes planning and plotting. Someone that likes going about their business and thinks about, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, etc., etc., etc. Someone along those lines. It's an example of Mercury square Saturn. Now, Neptune square Venus. Yeah, we already saw that Neptune square Mars or Mars square Neptune is a bad idea. The same thing with Venus, okay? Venus square Neptune or Neptune square Venus is not good. But like I said, since it's Venus, it's more prevalent or more applicable to women. Okay, a woman, for example, with Neptune square Venus, that was born under Neptune square Venus, will produce criminal behavior where sex is involved. Think of anything from being a prostitute to essentially sleeping with men in order to get ahead. And that's honestly the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it stands for example, in a woman's chart, it stands for a woman that will literally sleep with a man and then, depending on the other aspects, just kill the guy or poison him in order to get away with his money, you name it. Okay, anything where feminine dishonesty to the point where it becomes criminal comes into play, that's an example of Neptune square Venus or Venus square Neptune, whichever one you choose to or prefer to use. Now, Neptune square midheaven, okay, also generally speaking not good. It simply stands for a bad mentality in relation to work and authority, which leads to criminal behavior. Generally speaking, this is only the case if there is no positive aspect whatsoever. So if Neptune has no other positive aspects and it's only negative, think of a couple of oppositions, and in addition to that, it's squared the midheaven, it's squared the 10th house. The midheaven, for people that don't know what a midheaven is, it's simply the 10th house cusp. A cusp is simply a line that essentially signals the beginning of an astrological house. Okay, and that house is ruled by Capricorn, and it stands for authority figures. So if Neptune is square midheaven, negatively aspected the midheaven, specifically a square, then yeah, it stands for, again, mental disorganization and whatnot, and as a result, simply being dishonest, as in, let's just say, committing fraud with bookkeeping, administrative levels of fraud, okay? Nothing violent, but more administrative fraud where paperwork comes into play. Just think about that. Last but not least, I'm going to close off with Neptune opposed the Sun. Generally speaking, not good, okay? If Neptune and the Sun are negatively aspected one another and they're specifically opposed to each other, it simply stands for unreliability, okay, and being irresponsible and just outright dishonest. This is cheating, stealing from others left and right, you name it. It could be anything from petty theft to something on a much more serious note. That's what it stands for, okay? That's generally speaking what you can deduct. Unfortunately, not a lot of data on Pluto, but I think I can still come up with something for people, for listeners or viewers. Pluto. I already said in the beginning that Pluto deals more with affecting a lot of people. Okay. Let's see. For example, Pluto in Aries. Pluto in Aries, if Pluto is heavily afflicted, and it's, for example, in Aries and it's going retrograde, it simply stands for someone that has tyrant-like character about him or her. Okay, for example, if Pluto was in the 10th house when you were born and Pluto was in Aries and it went retrograde or it had other afflictions then you're going to be a tyrant, essentially. It stands for the fact that you'll be like the CEO or you'll be in a managerial position when it comes to career and work, but you'll abuse your power by absolutely mistreating those, so to speak, beneath you, treating your employees or others that fall under you within a career-wise or within the lines of a career or within the scope of career. You'll treat them like absolute garbage. You'll be aggressive and vicious towards them, and think of yelling and screaming. Think of a supervisor that yells and screams at the employees beneath him and is very stern and rarely smiles and whatnot. And yeah, that's an example of not necessarily criminal behavior, but it doesn't take a lot for that kind of attitude to devolve into criminality, essentially. The same essentially can be said of Pluto in Scorpio, but it has to be heavily afflicted. If Pluto has a lot of negative aspects, the likes of which the aspects I described, then yeah, okay, the person will be forceful and not in a good way, and the person will most likely display criminal behavior when it comes to finances specifically, belonging not to him directly or her. Okay, think about, again, like I said, someone working in a financial company, someone working for a payment processor, etc., and then the person essentially simply sticking money in their own pocket, taking kickbacks, or essentially committing administrative fraud to the point where they benefit from it financially, and it just goes on. Okay, yeah, that's an example. This also extends to, obviously, to war, for example. Hitler is an example. I don't know exactly what thing Hitler was born under, what constellation, but I remember briefly looking at it years ago when I was only a beginner, because I was curious about this. But again, it's not a black and white issue, and I have no interest in looking at it in detail. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Hitler had an afflicted Pluto. That's an example of what I mean. Okay, someone that has an afflicted Pluto, for example, a Pluto that is heavily afflicted, then yeah, the person will essentially be misguide people underneath him or her or beneath him or her. Hitler is an example, essentially leading thousands or millions of people to their deaths, so to speak, all under the guise of glorifying what he deems a just cause. Yeah, this is an example. Undoubtedly, Pluto was also aspected heavily negatively to Mars or Saturn or both. That's an example, okay? That's in any case what I wanted to discuss. So yeah, now you know, in any case. Bye bye.